Welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast, where in every episode we explore what is research culture and what should it be. You'll hear thoughts and opinions from a range of contributors to help you change research culture into what you want it to be.
So, welcome to our podcast session on meta-research and the role of professional staff. My name's Alix Brodie-Wray. I am a Faculty Impact Development Manager at the University of Leeds, and I am a fairly new podcast host for Research Culture Uncovered. Joined here today by my good ARMA co-chair colleagues, Dr. Chris Daley, Head of Research and Innovation Evidence and Analysis at LSE, and Dr. Amy Milligan, who's Head of Research Support and Administration at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. We want to talk to you a bit today about what meta-research is and what research managers and administrators, or more generally research enablers, can input into the meta-research landscape. So, if you're new to the concept of meta-research, what are we talking about? Well, meta-research in a nutshell is research on research, research about research, the processes, practices of getting it done, getting it published, getting it funded, and uncovering any sorts of biases that will improve the research environment more generally. I'll share some more definitions of that in the show notes. But without further ado, I thought I might give a little overview about why I'm interested in meta-research. So I don't have a PhD. I did try to have a PhD at one point, but I quit. I was part-time. I was working on cultural studies, doing stuff around psychogeography, nostalgia, and vintage fashion. But after about 7 years of being part-time, I just kind of got tired of it. Various things went down, and I think the fire just went out for me. However, concurrent to all that, I've been working in the research support space for quite a long time, and couldn't help but notice some, reflect on our practices and some of the research culture complexities around how we do research. And I got involved in a really cool project at Leeds about the experiences of staff in our rather large faculty of arts, humanities and cultures working in the research support space, and their experiences of career progression, their experiences at work. And that really was such an insightful project. It made me realise that even if I don't have a proper certified research background or anything too rigorous behind me, that some of those skills still came into play around testimony and oral history, even if that doesn't sound too highfalutin. And just noticing the sorts of power dynamics and I guess more broadly the culture around research. So the opportunity came up through the Association of Research Managers and Administrators for special interest group co-chairs. I thought, why not? Maybe as a seasoned research professional, I had a fair bit of insight into research and wouldn't mind learning more myself and also encouraging other people to kind of recognise the skill sets they have. I'd like to add as well, not at all exclusively from my PhD, as much as it wasn't completed, and that work, but just from being in the environment and seeing how it worked and thinking about what goes on behind the scenes. So I'll turn to Chris and Amy and ask them a few questions about why they got into meta-research. So shall I start with you, Amy? Why did you get into meta-research?
That's a good question, Alix. I think it was a gradual coming to meta-research. I trained as a historian and studied the history of books and publishing and did some research in that area for a while, including working on the history of Oxford University Press, which obviously publishes quite a lot of research. And I think became interested in the publishing of research. And gradually, when the postdocs dried up in history, moved into a role in academic publishing. And so looking at things like research integrity and the way research is is reviewed, published, shared, disseminated from a publishing angle became quite interesting to me, particularly having come from a research background myself. And then I saw this job come up at the University of Oxford for somebody to really manage all those processes, how research happens, how it gets published, from the academics point of view. I thought might be interesting, and applied. And it's true. There is a lot more than I had even thought about, I think, in research on research. And it's been interesting bringing all of the strands of my own history to inform how I do my job as a research administrator, I think.
How about you, Chris? What point in your career did you sort of think I could really link into the meta research landscape?
Yeah, again, like a lot of people, stumbled across it by accident in some ways. So I'd first been, when I was doing my PhD, I was actually interested in open access publishing, which was really taking off in the kind of early to mid 2010s. And so I had some engagement with people who were researchers and PhD students who had started to kind of advocate for open access publishing. So I kind of first got involved in that. Then I actually got a job after I finished my PhD in a university library and discovered that there was actually a whole world of kind of practice-based research within the library community. So there were library journals. There were a lot of my colleagues who worked in kind of the metric side of things were interested in scientometrics, research evaluation, and they published on this, and they published in journals. And so I thought, actually, you don't have to necessarily be an academic to still be involved in some kind of research. And that kind of research you could be involved in if you're in a professional services kind of role was more of that kind of meta research on research kind of world. So I kind of stumbled across it through working in libraries. And I think then when I moved into more kind of research office roles, and I became slightly more senior, I was asked to do a lot of work, a lot of reporting work, a lot of work that was around leading programs or initiatives. I kind of realized that the best way to get buy-in for these from both senior research managers, but also from academics who are trying to often sell programs to, like, this is what we should do in terms of a research strategy and things like this, was to have strong underlying evidence. And so I started to kind of realize that the kind of approach I should take would be not just to come up with ideas and put it to academics, but also undertake some research and develop a kind of evidence base to support anything I did. So I kind of realized I was doing a kind of practice-based meta research through my day job as well. So that's how I kind of stumbled into it, one through libraries and then through just having a bit more responsibility in my roles in research management.
That's really interesting you said about libraries, because here at Leeds, we have the wonderful Nick Shepherd. When I mentioned we were doing this podcast, he was like, I know all this. He had this wealth of knowledge about meta research, and it was really interesting because I think I've come at it from a different angle to him. And I think for me, it was about impact, actually, to some degree. It was almost like the confluence of that impact agenda, as they called it, then it gave us opportunities, I think, and I could see examples then, people in roles like ours contributing to that research. So that set a sort of precedent. And then I guess some of the research development work I did at the University of Brighton with the Concordat, maybe someone made a little quip that you could tell they'd asked a researcher to do this Concordat rollout scheme. And I was like, I think I'm actually, there are various skills going on here that I've got through just various different threads. Amy, did you have another thought on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting that you mentioned people publishing in the field of meta research, because that's another angle that brought me to the subject. One of the journals I looked after was actually a research on research journal. And so speaking to the editors of that and coming up with ideas for the journal got me really interested in how the researchers look at research and how it's done. And how it might occasionally be done a little bit better. And I think the evidence base is definitely part of it, but also applying that kind of scrutiny to research and looking at what what's fair, what's inclusive, what's successful, what's maybe less successful or less inclusive, and of analysis is just as valuable for our ecosystem as it is for the other things that researchers study.
Yeah, that idea of fairness and equity actually reminds me of work I've done on the Athena Swan. Do you know what I mean? So I was lucky enough to head up a working group for faculty operations, organisation and culture. And that was fun because I was leading academics for the first time, or herding cats, as I think they sometimes call it. But it worked quite well, and in a way, that kind of EDI focus can be another way in, can't it? Where you might come to a point in your career where you think, I've got something to say about EDI at a university, where that you may feel more comfortable even starting out in that space, which is like, explicitly inclusive in terms of figuring out, how your skills fit in potentially to what is effectively better research, even if people don't call it that. So, Chris, I'll start with you this time. So what do you think that research managers and administrators, or research enablers more broadly, can contribute to meta research that might be distinct from academics?
Yeah, so I think that the primary area of expertise that we have is around kind of understanding what actually functions on the ground in terms of the research and innovation ecosystem. So, for example, you just think of someone who's think of the range of activities that there are within a research office. It covers a kind of broad breadth of things from pre to post-award. So people who work in sort of research professional type roles typically have kind of intricate understanding of things like funder policies and strategies, detailed knowledge of like grant applications and the actual processes across multiple different funding bodies. They have knowledge about kind of things like research integrity, research security, regularly scrutinize government R&D policies. So picking out what this might mean for different university types or different disciplines, etc. And I think also the other key role is around kind of this translational work. So the meta science, meta research on research is quite popular with academics. There's a kind of broad range of academics across a range of disciplines who are involved in this. But so there is a kind of a gap there for people who have these kind of translational skills, who can kind of take the academic evidence and find ways of translating that into kind of concrete policies or kind of process proposals. And I think that that's where kind of people who are in more professional roles have a kind of really important role. And I should also add that I looked at the UK Meta Science Unit. I looked back at their first round of research grants and what they put in the core guidance, being a kind of good research manager. And they defined really helpfully, they defined meta science in two ways. They said on the one hand that it's researchers using rigorous social scientific methods. But then they said that it was also, I'm quoting here, a community of practice united by an interest in designing, implementing and evaluating innovative modes of science funding and delivery. So they've recognized that it is both about rigorous social scientific methodologies and approaches, which would probably be more dominated by academics, but then it's also about then using that evidence to actually kind of transform the research innovation system to make it more equitable, to make it more efficient, more effective. And that's where really people in more professional roles are really going to be crucial. So yeah, I'd say that's where we kind of come in.
Yeah, Amy, any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think meta research can enable research managers and administrators to contribute to research by providing evidence about the things they do. They can gather data on their own processes and activities and advise on policy, as Chris says. But I think the other part that interests me is that we can put those research findings back into practice in a way that researchers can do sometimes, but in their own own activities. I think research managers and administrators can affect perhaps a larger group with a positive change. So if we introduce a new way of supporting people with grant applications, that will affect a number of people and perhaps make a positive change across a larger group. And I think that can be really valuable. I think our input in policy can do that too. So yeah, I think it's both contributing information, expertise, and data about how we do what we do, but also then making sure that the feedback loop is complete and putting kind of new policies, recommendations, and evidence into our own decisions about how research is managed and supported.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think that, reflecting what you said as well, Chris, around the meta science unit and that two-tier kind of understanding, it's like bringing in an equal weight to those aspects of meta research or meta science, because I think it's a sort of perennial problem perhaps in the research space. I think it's reflected in the way that we, when we're having conversations around the academic and non-academic divide or around certain types of research at a research intensive institution, there's a little bit of lopsidedness there, isn't there, in terms of understanding the theory versus the practice. So I think that's what's quite nice about research managers, administrators and professionals and enablers being involved in this in that way. It's that reflection of equal respect or equal recognition of both the theory and the practice and our role in the theory as well. Does that make any sense? I almost see it like two shapes, where one's normally more highly esteemed and visible than the other, practice, in so many different contexts in the university. And as an arts and humanities person, we talk about practice research, but, practice more generally and applying research, is a big part of what we can bring into it, but not the only part. So instead of seeing like one big chunk of monolith of recognition and esteem, and then this sort of us holding it up, like Atlas or something with the world, it's like that interplay between them and that like parity of esteem. That's my utopia anyway, which is nice. So, I did touch on a little bit at the beginning of my intro about my non-PhD, the PhD that never was, and whether or not that had anything to do with my interest in meta research, because I'd been an administrator for much longer than I'd been a researcher. So, I started off 20 years ago at the University of Brighton. I was lucky enough to do my master's for free at Sussex because we shared a med school. And then I was doing this part-time PhD moving into the research space. I already had this massive background of dealing with spreadsheets. I'm just going to put it very bluntly. I mean, it's more complicated than that, really. But dealing with information and data and negotiating the higher education landscape, even before I started off. So for me, I'm not sure how much it was to do with my PhD at all, or my non-PhD, and maybe more to do with the practice I even had generally in terms of basic kind of information handling skills. That sort of drew me to research as someone who might feel outside of that. What do you think? Do you need a PhD to do research? Who wants to go first? Amy, you look poised to go first.
I'll go first. No, is the simple answer. I do have a PhD, but I did research in order to get my PhD. So clearly you don't need it to get started.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's so funny, isn't it? We think of it as like the thing, and actually what's led into it is the thing.
So, I mean, I won't say that it hasn't helped. Certainly having a solid grounding in particular research methods, which you learn in a PhD, can be really helpful when conducting meta research, but it's not an absolute requirement. I think certainly solid information handling skills, I think is what you said, that can be learned in a variety of ways. And the academic route is one way to learn that, but on the job is certainly another and a just as valuable way to learn that skill. I think I would say that when looking at the field of research, it is helpful to have an understanding of how universities work and researchers work. And I think we can gather that as administrators, but it also helps to talk to academic colleagues if you're thinking about things that particularly affect academic colleagues. So career paths, for example. So having the access, I think, to a lab, or in our case, a university or research institute, that's valuable too. And you can kind of fill in the gaps in your own expertise, perhaps by talking to other people or bringing on colleagues like Chris who have really strong data skills, if that's not your cup of tea, or perhaps you're better at talking to people and doing the kind of qualitative approach, and your colleague can rely on you for that. So I think you don't have to do it all by yourself. So you can definitely fill in some of the gaps in your own knowledge by working with really helpful and intelligent, knowledgeable colleagues. But no, you don't need your own PhD. You just need a solid plan, a lot of support, and the willingness to learn a new skill.
That's great. Chris, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with Amy that you don't have to have a PhD. It can be helpful just because you've had experience of delivering a research project in that regard. But it's in terms of the kind of specific knowledge might not necessarily be helpful. I mean, I did a PhD in a humanities discipline. I was looking at British science fiction and the Cold War for my PhD. So, and I've moved now to a role where I'm looking at large data sets, and I've had to sort of reskill in some ways and do kind of courses in data analysis and things like this that, they didn't require a PhD. These were things that I learned on the job in my research management job. And so it can be helpful, but it's not absolutely essential. What I would say is important, though, is that you do need to have a kind of intellectual curiosity about the research and innovation ecosystem. So the ability to kind of think just beyond your day job, as it were, to think about how your role contributes to kind of the broader system that you're in. I think that's really important for any kind of good meta-scientific research, is that you have that kind of, you think, right, I do this role, but how does this relate to the kind of broader national system, broader international ecosystem, etc.? Be just interested in those kind of things. I think that is important. But again, it doesn't need a PhD to do that. You can just read around the subject and become interested in it. The other thing, as a practical thing that I think is important, is around being able to work collaboratively. Because I received some funding from the UK Meta Science Unit, and that was through their sandpit they ran last year, which was called Data for Meta Science, and they're running another sandpit on scientometrics this year in 2026. And in order to kind of build up a project team during that sandpit, I needed to kind of work with not just people who were in the same sort of role as me, but I had to reach out to academics as well. So I think that ability to kind of be able to bring people together who are from diverse kind of roles, so be able to kind of speak to academics and talk to them about what you would bring to a project or how you might want them to help you with a project, I think is really important. So that kind of ability to navigate a very kind of interdisciplinary environment is really important as well. But again, it doesn't mean you need to have a PhD. You can. There's lots of people who could do that with just being great networkers, basically. So yeah, they're the kind of tips I would give for being involved in this.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've lost my train of thought now. I had a little follow-up there. I'll cut this bit out. At the ARMA conference last year, we did our survey, didn't we, into how research managers, administrators coming to the conference felt about meta research being involved in that. And aside from time as a barrier, there was a sense from some people that, like, why should we? So it was really interesting what you were both saying there about, finding those connections, or, not everybody has to do it. Not everybody has to do meta research. So we have this sometimes, especially with the really well-intentioned work that we do through the Technicians Concordat and encouraging technicians to be recognised for their input into research, of accidentally placing the same pressures on that staff group. And it's came through a little bit, didn't it, in the ref, planning exercises that were going into the latest iteration of the ref. People were talking about why. And I've been in rooms where academics have said, why would we want to include research professionals and technicians. Surely they're not expected to do research. So I think I always want to sort of say, if you find yourself drawn to this, it's so useful, the advice we've had so far about doing that. But, we have to be careful of some of the unintended consequences in terms of pressure that people feel when we talk about this. So it's almost an option, isn't it? It's a direction you could go in. People shouldn't feel like they have to go in. Yeah.
No. Yeah, so just to jump in, no, I don't think that it is. And I think actually it's important to kind of make a caveat around, for anyone who wants to get involved in meta research, who's in a professional services role, that it is a time-consuming thing to do, and that there is a kind of barrier around what our roles are designed to do, and the kind of additional pressure that you would add on top of it by being involved in a kind of meta research project. Because I work with RL UK with the AHRC have a program for librarians to kind of build up their confidence for applying for research grants. And one of the kind of major barriers and areas that we have to navigate through that scheme is the way in which people say, well, my contract is for me to deliver particular services for our academics or students, etc. So how am I meant to find the time to sort of like move into researcher mode and do kind of a meta science project? And so I think that that's something that we need to be very frank about, that is a challenge. Because, I mean, I have this meta science unit grant, and I find that it's quite tricky because I'll be going from my normal week where I'm having one-to-ones with people in my team, having team meetings, having regular meetings, delivering to deadlines that are set like week by week and stuff, as just part of my day job. And then I kind of find I've also got to do this grant as well. And I have to switch into a kind of different mode of working, which is very much around kind of I would describe it as kind of long form work, where I'm having to kind of really interrogate this material in quite a lot of depth, have to kind of think about how am I going to disseminate these findings in terms of academic papers, in terms of policy outputs, things like this, which is a kind of completely different way of working to my day job, which is much more, I work in a kind of role that is a bit more kind of researchy focused in a way, but it's still a professional services role where I have kind of deadlines to meet and regular meetings to attend and things like that. So I think that it's really important that we are frank with people that it is challenging, but it's not impossible, and it is actually very rewarding if you can do it, because of the thing I spoke about earlier, about that ability to collaborate with really interesting people across the ecosystem. So I'm working at the moment with computer scientists at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going up there next week. And that's like really, really exciting to be doing that and to be working with these people who are brilliant. But it obviously is a bit different to what my day job is. And I think we have to just be honest with people about that.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that some institutions will be more open to professional services staff taking on research projects in a significant way. And I think part of the reason they would be open to it is because those research projects are usually designed to help research work better, more efficiently, more inclusively, to improve things. And I think that's one reason why professional staff are interested in participating. They also want to make things work better. And I think that drive to share your insight into how things might be improved is one good reason to get involved in meta research. But I think that's a reason to do it yourself. I think we should also remember that there are other ways to engage with meta research which don't require you to apply for a major grant and take on a whole new job outside your regular job. There are often calls for participants to share their expertise in ongoing research on research. So if you see a survey about how professional services staff feel about this policy or that process change, feel free to lend your expertise, because that research might then inform a meta-research study which goes on to improve a policy or a practice. Similarly, if you are interested in research findings and integrating those into your own thoughts about how you do your job, or perhaps improving a process locally, I would encourage you to explore some of the meta-research that's already been published so that you can add some of that knowledge to your own kind of ways of working.
Yeah, that's so useful. And I was thinking as well about changes in the higher education landscape and the way we do research. And I know a lot of institutions, it's felt a bit like, I'm not sure how universal the experience is, but I've kind of gathered from speaking to other people with this sort of shrinkage of the sector a little bit. Maybe people feel a bit inhibited, either because of the structures. There's sort of clamping down on this is academic, this is not academic. Maybe there's a bit of a sort of rollback on what a few years ago people were calling the third space, just in terms of capacity. But I really liked what you were both saying about the benefits as well of that, while recognising the limitations or the moment that we're in, which seems a little bit precarious. So that kind of leads on to my next question. What next for meta research? I know we had a lunchtime drop-in which focused a little bit on the meta science unit and the opportunities there. But what next more generally for the involvement of research enablers and managers and administrators in the meta research landscape? Chris?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's really taking off at the moment, meta research and meta science more generally. So the meta science unit in the most recent budget saw its funding triple to 49 million, I think, over the next 4 years. So that's really a significant increase in what it had before. So there's obviously a recognition within government that this is a really important area that it wants to fund, because it feels that as Amy was talking about, that the kind of benefits are going to be really substantial if we kind of apply kind of evidence-based findings to the research system. And this will kind of produce great efficiencies, potentially kind of make it fairer, make it more transparent, make it more creative and things like this. So there's obviously an appetite within government to fund this. And really interestingly, I've seen just in the last few weeks, a number of adverts from organisations like RAND Europe and the Tony Blair Institute that have been advertising for roles that are kind of for people working in their R&I policy and meta science teams, in kind of officer type roles. And that's really interesting. So they've obviously picked up on the fact there's been greater investment from government. They're also seeing this as a big thing within research and innovation funding and research and innovation policy. So are investing in that in terms of staffing as well. And I wonder whether this might translate into universities as well, that there starts to be more of a kind of interest in having these kind of roles that kind of use data and evidence to kind of help with decision making at a local level. But I think it's really important that research managers and administrators really kind of speak up about our expertise and our role in this area and don't feel kind of afraid to be part of this, because I think meta science generally, so I was at the meta science conference at UCL last year, and while there were quite a few research managers there or people from funders and things like this, it was very academic dominated, largely social scientists, I would say, but it was very, very, very researcher dominated. But as we've seen from the meta science definition of what the landscape is, there is a really big part for us to play in that. So I think we need to be confident and speak up for our role, because I think it is, funders and government do want to hear from us. So I think we should be confident in that.
I think that leads on really nicely to what my answer to that question was. What's the future for meta research? And I think much of the meta research that's already happened has been really focused on the publications. So kind of looking at the bibliometrics and at open science publications and at academic research culture and career paths and so on. But I think there is a growing understanding that the ecosystem of research includes a whole variety of career pathways of different people with different skills doing different jobs. And so I think really the future for meta research is to start thinking about the ecosystem as a whole and how the other parts of that landscape, we keep using these big words, but how those kind of are impacted or impact research. And I think very much that research managers are going to be a part of that conversation, both as research subjects, but also as knowledgeable experts on this world in which we are all operating. So I think that expansion of meta-research to include a broader vision of what supports, enables, and constitutes research is the next step, really.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. I mean, I think a couple of things came up for me when you were both talking then, one around adjacent sectors. Do you know what I mean? And you can, I for one can be very focused on, I've worked for 20 years in the university. We forget about funders or these other bodies, that may be looking for our skills.
Publishers.
And partners, publishers, of course. And then, I think about, I work in the impact space. So, sometimes you see fascinating looking roles working for charities or other organizations around evaluation. It's almost like, and I can kind of see, we might feel like the sector's contracting, but maybe there's actually a broadening of our skill set in different settings, which I think is a nice optimistic note to end on. So thanks so much, Chris and Amy, for talking to me about meta-research. It's endlessly fascinating.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for listening to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. Please subscribe so you never miss out on our brand new episodes. And if you're enjoying the discussions, give us some love by dropping a 5-star rating and written review, as it helps other research culturists find us. And please share with a friend and show them how to subscribe. Email us at academicdev@leeds.ac.uk. Thanks for listening, and here's to you and your research culture.